Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Classic Dune. And today I'm going to be talking about, well, how to win Dune. So, this is going to be the first episode of a little mini series, which is probably going to be something along the lines of how to win. But I'm basically going to cover the early game strategies. So, and for me, I classify that as turns 1 through 3. And Dude's a pretty complicated game. There's so many variables, so many things can change depending on what faction you're using, what variants you're using, to the point where it's kind of difficult to, nail down like, it's not like chess where there's distinct openings and you do specific moves. It's such a varied game just by the fact that there's so many variables, and also there's 6 players. There's 5 other people at the table who each could have their own unique play styles and ways that they do things. So it's tough to give specific openings. But what I think I can do is boil down some general strategies, because I think in Dune, it can be easy when you're starting out to do things that seem like they're productive, but they're actually not. You know, for example, just a simple thing, going for spice, but you could have theoretically have a win attempt and you miss out on what could have been like a 70% chance of winning the game because you're going for spice. And I mean, you'd think more spice is always good, right? But sometimes the board in Dune can be in flux so much that these narrow opportunities to win can come and go in a single turn, or even just in a couple players' moves during a single phase. You make one move going first in the shipping movement phase, and there's a win attempt. But if you don't make it, it's completely gone, and the next player changes the board state drastically to where, who knows what could happen. Um, but general strategies. So let's go into it. How to win at Dune. Well, in your first 3 turns, what do you want to be doing to be able to win? Because most games of Dune, I find they end earliest turns 4 or 5. Um, it's decently common for you to have like a turn 3 win, but turns 1 and 2 are pretty rare with a couple exceptions. So in the first 3 turns, if you're not winning, if you're not, playing a very aggressive early game strategy, your best course towards winning is actually making yourself a marketable ally. So you want to build up the things that make people want to ally with you, and then you go on to win with that ally. Because most games of Dune, I think, at any table, will usually end with an alliance winning rather than a solo victory. With the exception, I guess, being special victory conditions like the Bene Gesserit prediction, or maybe like a guild winning solo, or even when they're allied, it's a bit of a different story. But yeah, most games are going to end with an alliance winning. And if you're not an early game faction, or even if you are, if you're just not going for it, if you're not winning in these first 3 turns, you're probably winning in an alliance. So you want to work towards getting into a good alliance rather than necessarily winning the game in these first 3 turns. And I think there is a set of factions where you can really screw yourself over if you just think about directly trying to get yourself in a position to win the game rather than trying to get yourself in a position to ally with the person who will eventually help you win the game. Now, all that preamble out of the way, I'm going to get into it. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to categorize the 12 factions here into 3.5 groups. Um, and that the half comes in because one of the groups has 2 factions that kind of stand out slightly in a niche case. But let's get into it. So we're going to take these. I'm going to take these 6 factions here, these 4 factions here, and these 2 factions here. These are our 3, and then we'll get the 0.5 group here. Okay, so these groupings all It's based on the board state of each faction and generally what they excel in and generally what strategies best lead them towards winning the game, especially when the first three turns are concerned. So let's look at the first group here, and this is the group where you start with forces on the board, a good deal of forces, and you are generally a faction that is more fighty. You have to be going out and collecting spice blows, and um, the big thing about this group of factions is that you start on the board in force, and you have very minimal ways of controlling whether or not you get into fights, especially if you're going early in turn order. Any one of these factions going early in turn order on the first few turns can get really screwed over. You have to play very carefully. Now, why is having forces on the board at the start of the game such a big deal? You would think that's good because forces on the board is directly how you win the game, particularly with them being in strongholds. Well, that's because forces on the board are both an opportunity and a liability. They're an opportunity in that they're how you win the game, but they're a liability because the only way for you to get attacked and potentially lose resources in a battle is by having forces on the board. So any place that you have forces, whether it be a stronghold, whether it be some guys left over on a spice blow, or, sitting in rock territory waiting to move in, they are potentially a target for someone to attack to try to kill your leaders, make you discard cards, and possibly even make you spend spice on dialing if you're playing advanced. So that's what I mean where you have to be careful with starting on the board with forces because in most cases, that's not going to directly lead to you winning the game in the first three turns. So with these factions, the main consideration is that because you start in a vulnerable state, and you're not like the guild who can cross ship away or the BG who can flip two advisors, you can't avoid battles if you're going early in storm order. You really need to watch out how much you overextend yourself in terms of board presence, like trying to control another stronghold in addition to the one you start in, and also buying lots of cards, like spending all, let's say as the Harkonnen, spending all 10 of your spice on cards in the first turn. Because both of those have the potential to really screw yourself over. So, in the first turn, if you are one of these six factions, I'd say you definitely want to buy a card so that you have more than just the one you start with to threaten people with. But you also definitely want to keep some spice in reserves, unless you're the Fremen, of course, because if you do get attacked and you have the opportunity to counter it, you can ship in more forces, or if you're playing advanced, even if you've already gone, you at least have some spice left over to be able to dial with. And the main reason why you want to keep some of this spice instead of trying to buy a card and maybe it's a weapon or defense is that buying cards is inherently a gamble, especially if you're playing advanced where you can spice dial. Spice reserves is just guaranteed value in combat. You can always ship in more forces to dial higher or spend more spice again in advance to dial higher. But if you spend 5 spice on a card and it's worthless, or it's something like atomics or weather control or some other non-combat card, that's 5 spice you don't have anymore to ship in forces with or dial with. So when it comes to winning a battle, that was essentially a waste of 5 spice. And if you end up getting attacked, that's a card that's not going to help you win that battle, and you could lose it. You could start losing leaders, and any cards you do commit to the battle plan to try to win with, you could potentially be losing. And in addition, if you lose the battle, you lose those forces there. So now, a main component of your faction's strength, which is the forces they start on the board with, is gone. So you're losing resources that you really cannot afford to lose. So that's what I mean when I say that you start the game in a vulnerable position. It's from that vulnerability that you have the opportunity to win the game, but you don't want to, you want to hedge your bets, essentially. You don't want to go all in on buying lots of cards and hoping you get good ones. You want to keep some spice back to protect yourself in case you get attacked. Now, the 3.5, the point 0.5 group here is Harkonnen and the Ixians. These are two factions which start with a good amount of forces on the board in strongholds, and they have a theoretical path to victory on the very first or second turn, because the Harkonnens, they start here in Carthag, and that's just one Ornithopter trip away from Siege Tabor for their second stronghold, and dropping into one of these unoccupied sieges like Habanya and potentially 2x. So that's 3 strongholds right there, and as Harkonnen, you start with 2 cards and you spend a couple spice, and now you got 4. That's You're gonna stand a decent chance of winning a battle there, not even mentioning potential traitor call. So turn 1 or 2 Harkonnen is sometimes a genuine threat, especially if they're going last, where they can just choose whether or not they want to go for it, better based on if the opportunity is there, the board state, if the strongholds are open, if some of the more early game oriented factions haven't really committed to the board, then they could just go for it and see what happens. And maybe they're just fighting 1 Bene Gesserit or 5 Guildsmen, and that's all they need to win the game. And the other one is going to be the Ixians, who similarly, they start on the board in their hidden mobile stronghold. And if they put it here, let's say, or here, next to a stronghold, they can walk in with their cyborgs and then ship in somewhere else. So same idea, and they are also more combat oriented because they pick basically the best card from the starting cards, and they also know which 12 cards are in the game, the 6 dealt at the start and the 6 bid on. So they have a decent chance, or they have a decent idea of what their chances are of winning any given battle, just because it's like, hey, I have a projectile weapon and there's only 1 shield in the game, and only 3 factions here that I'm fighting bought a card when the shield was up for auction. So, only one of them can have it. That kind of mentat stuff. So, Ixians and Harkonnen, they make up a little niche group where they do still have that vulnerability, but they can directly leverage that into consistent early game wins if the board is right. If it's not right, then they just, bide their time, and they're like one of these other 6 factions here. Another slight exception here, but not enough to be like a whole group of their own, is the Fremen, where they start with no spice, but they also need no spice to do things. They don't need to pay to ship or dial in advance. And what this leads to is the Fremen have to really throw themselves at the board and just try to get some spice, try to get their economy going. And so that liability, it's not as big a deal for them just because they have that revival rate, and they can afford to just chuck 10 to 15 forces into a spice blow just so they have a decent chance of outdialing their opponent to win a battle and collecting that spice, because that for Fremen is worth so much more in the long term than those forces will be. All right, our next group here, populated by only 2 factions here, is the Tleilaxu and the Rishes. And these are factions which start off the board with very little spice, but they need to bend Arrakis to their will. They start off the board, but they need to get onto it very quickly. Because, oh, and I guess I haven't even mentioned this, but making yourself a marketable ally entails not falling into any of these pitfalls by losing a major battle early on. And it also relies on you steadily building up a good hand of cards and keeping 1, possibly 2 strongholds decently under your control, like 7 to 10 forces in it. And since these factions start with the forces on the board, they can just worry about harvesting a little bit of spice and spending a little bit of that spice buying cards to bolster their hand. And then once that first Nexus rolls around, if they've done that, they haven't lost any major battles, they're going to be a good potential ally. These 2 factions here, if they slow roll it, they will not be on anyone's list of potential allies. They'll be rolling solo. And that's because they don't start on the board. In the case of Richesse, they want to build up a nice stronghold with some forces in it, which they can do pretty easily because because of their selling cards advantage, they don't have to throw themselves at a spice blow and risk losing. They can sell cards that build up spice that way and then spend it on buying cards and also their cheap no field shipment. But the Tleilaxu are different in a very weird way because them having strongholds on the board isn't that big a deal. What really is a big deal is getting their economy rolling, getting those tanks filled with dead forces so that they start earning a ton of spice every single turn. That is what makes the Tleilaxu a very marketable ally, very desirable, because once it gets to a certain point where the tanks are pretty full and people are just dying and being revived and dying and being revived, the Tleilaxu are profiting off of it, it doesn't usually wind back down. Uh, the tanks really only ramp up, and it's just a matter of ramping it up really quickly early on that makes Tleilaxu a really attractive ally. It's still going to be hard pressed for you to actually be one of those higher tier ally candidates like the Emperor or like the Bene Gesserit early on, turn 3 and 4 when the Nexus happens. But it still doesn't hurt to at least try to get that, like, second best ally. You probably won't snag the first best ally. But as Tleilaxu, you just want to make sure the game lasts long enough to where you're in a strong position, or failing that, you want to get yourself to that stronger position as fast as possible. Now, Tleilaxu's got to commit to the board to cause some mayhem, to start some fights, because depending on your table, depending on the other players at the table, nothing might happen if you don't encourage it. There might not be a lot of huge battles. People might just throw fights and be peaceful and get along. So you've really got to be the wrench thrown into the works to stir up the pot, get things going, get fights happening. And Tleilaxu really doesn't play like any other faction here, so you can get some good insights on how they go about doing that in my Strengths and Strategies video. Check that out. But yeah, these two factions here, they start off the board, start very poor, and they need to, in some way, get onto the board to build themselves up. And then these last four factions here, they start off the board and they're not hard pressed to get onto it too quickly. These are factions, they're primarily economy factions. Three of them, that is. We got the Emperor, wow, the Emperor, Guild, and Chom. And whatever happens, they're still going to be collecting a lot of money and they're going to be economically relevant. They don't have to push things into that direction like the Tleilaxu do. And then you have the Bene Gesserit, who really, no matter what happens, they can lay back. And when that first Nexus hits on turn 3 or 4, they're still going to be a great ally just because of that voice ability. It's such a good ability. It's the best in the game. And their alliance ability is just giving that ability to their ally. So they are, by default, one of the best allies at the table, no matter what. There's even a time where I almost won while I'd allied to the Bene Gesserit with 4 strongholds myself. And it was just using them for their alliance advantage and not so much for any position they held on the board. So these are all factions that are great as allies, even if they're sitting in space. And quite frankly, in some cases, they may not want to risk getting onto the board early on in the game. They may as well just sit in space if they can, build up their strength, and buy cards and not expose themselves to too much risk, just because they don't have to. They're not like these factions where nobody wants to ally with them unless they commit to the board, or these factions where they're already on the board and they have to defend what they already have, and they have to be very slow and risk averse about it. These factions, they start off the board, they got no major pressures to get onto it, and so they could just chill, bide their time, and it's pretty certain. With these 4 factions, you can't really do anything wrong here. Really, the worst thing that could happen is if one of these more aggressive factions goes for an early win and the can gets kicked down to the road and it hits you in the head, and you've now got to spend spice dropping 10 forces onto them to stop them. And even if you prevent their win attempt, you know, you're going to be hurting pretty bad because of all those forces you've had to commit to the tanks, all that spice you've had to spend doing so, and, all that secret information in the form of what cards you've bought being revealed to the table. So that's pretty much the worst thing that could happen for these four factions here, other than, committing too hard to the board and getting punished for it. That's also a potential thing that can happen. In fact, I once saw an Emperor player. It was their first time playing Emperor with homeworlds on the board, and they tried to go for an aggressive early game win. They dropped all five Sardaukar onto the board, like you might normally as an Emperor player, but they didn't realize that the occupied penalty for Salusa Secundus is that your Sardaukar are worth one instead of their normal two. And so they went for a crazy win attempt, and then someone just put one single force on Salusa, and now all of a sudden their Sardaukar were completely gutted. And they definitely got learned. They learned a very punishing and poignant lesson that day. But yeah, these factions, you can play slow, you can commit to the board a little bit more. It's always, me personally, I play, my self-coined broke emperor playstyle. I do like to get aggressive, buy lots of cards, and commit to the board early. And I guess the secret's out now, but I like to leverage the fact that everyone just assumes the emperor is always rich and they have like 20 to 30 spice, that I could be, completely broke and nobody would guess it unless they were specifically counting my spice. But with Emperor, the sheer volume of transactions, sometimes it's tough to count that accurately. So yeah, that is really covering your first three turns in Dune. Regardless of which faction you're playing, it's all about making yourself a marketable ally and getting yourself into that position where hopefully you can, at that, pretty common turn 3 or 4 Nexus ally with a strong player at the table, and then win either that turn or the next one or two. That's really your best case scenario, because you can't really hope to win in the first 3 turns unless you are specifically the Ixians or the Harkonnen. And even then, sometimes the cards just don't get dealt right, and it's not even a chance. A lot of times you can commit too hard to the board early on, regardless of which of these factions you are, and you'll get punished for it. So really, it's all about being reserved in these first 3 turns, but you also have to be vigilant. Gotta make sure that one of these 6 factions here aren't trying to make some bold gambit and go for an early win, because somebody's got to stop them. And the earlier the table realizes it, the earlier they can figure out who is best positioned to stop them. If maybe the table wants to leave it to the guild, or maybe the table wants to pressure the Atreides to sell knowledge on the person's hand for very cheap. But yeah, got to be vigilant and reserved, risk averse generally. And then specifically, let's boil it down to a sentence: protect what you already start with. Go out on the board and earn your alliance marketability. And these ones are kind of protect the status quo. Don't let anything crazy happen, and just wait until you get that first nexus, because it's when you get an alliance that you can really do some dangerous stuff. So that's going to do it for now. That's the first episode on this How to Win a Classic Dune series. Keep an eye out for part 2, where I'll cover the mid-game. That's going to be turns 4 through 7, I think. And that'll be when a lot of win attempts happen, is 4 through 7, regardless of if they are successful or not. And it's always a really interesting time in the game, is, if a win attempt succeeds or if it fails, and you see the factions pick up the pieces and fill those new power vacuums. So keep an eye out for that, and until then, I catch y'all next time.